Well, welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to see you all here. My name is Jije Colon. I'm the Executive Director for the Wildlife Conservation Network. And I want to thank all of you for joining us today and for your ongoing trust and generosity for all the work that we do and your support of our mission at the Wildlife Conservation Network that many of you are already familiar with. But just as a matter of reminder, we really exist to protect endangered animals by supporting conservationists to ensure that people and wildlife can coexist and thrive. And several of you have been with us for many years and are familiar with our approach internationally. And so we're really thrilled to have the opportunity to present to you how we are porting this approach to work here much closer to home here in California. We are, of course, keeping the same values. I see that we have no audio, apparently. I am going to take a stop then. Megan, plenty. I can see some people saying they can hear. Okay, so people can hear me. I will then continue and say that, and I hope that that Ingrid can get an audio sorted out. What I was saying is that we are porting the same approach that we do to our international work here to our domestic work. That means that we bring forward the values of transparency, of collaboration, of efficiency, 100% model, meaning that if people donate to a specific program, 100% of that money goes to that program. And collaboration, that we really look at working with a number of different organizations because these missions are too big for any single organization to really tackle alone. And transparency is exactly what today is about. It's putting you directly in touch with conservationists and the opportunity for you to ask questions and find out about the impact of the work. So it's a real pleasure today to be on this call with you and with my colleague Neal Sharma to talk about the WCN California Wildlife Program. As I said, it's really the first time that we are supporting conservation in North America. And our initial focus centers around issues and interventions that relate to pumas and habitat fragmentation, including efforts to restore and maintain connectivity for California's vulnerable puma populations. We are really excited to be able to apply the added value and WCN's collaborative and flexible model towards these efforts here. And we are blessed to have an incredible leader for that program who joined WCN fairly recently in the grand scheme of things, but many of you probably haven't had a chance to meet him yet. Neal Sharma, who is an incredible individual and conservationist. He's motivated by a respect for life on this planet. He is so driven to apply his energy towards the protection of wildlife with respect for all communities involved with ecological integrity in mind. He is deeply accomplished. Prior to working at WCN, he worked with the Peninsula Open Space Trust, or POST. Some of you might be familiar with that organization here located in the Bay Area. There he focused on their efforts to establish a protected areas network of various resilient ecosystems to enable wildlife to persist and adapt in this rapidly changing world. And so now he has the opportunity to continue that work and take it at a different scale and connect it to other efforts. And in addition to doing all of this, Neal is a very accomplished musician, a poet, a cook, a gardener. He is an incredible human being. So if you ever have a chance to meet him in person or to engage with him online, I'm sure you will find it extremely rewarding. And with that introduction, I'm going to turn it over to Neal and look forward to learning about the California Wildlife Program. One last thing, actually, that I was about to forget. Hopefully all those audio issues are sorted out. Neal's going to present for about 25 minutes, 30 minutes-ish. And afterwards, we'll engage in a question and answer session. So you can use the Q&A or the chat function to type in your questions, and then I'll ask them of Neal afterwards. You can type them during the presentation, and I will ask him at the end. And as we're going through the Q&A, you can keep on typing questions. We'll try to get through as many of them as possible. Again, thank you for joining, and thank you, Neal, for your leadership, and over to you.
Well, thank you, Jije, a very kind and generous introduction. And also thank you all for your interest in WCN's California program and for making the time to be with us today. visual displaying properly? Thank you. So in our time here today, I'll start by sharing a bit about the premise and approach for the new California Wildlife Program. And then I'll highlight a selection of projects that we're so honored to be supporting and keep that in context of the conservation strategy for the program. And then towards the end of the session here, we'll go a bit deeper into the topic of wildlife crossing infrastructure. And yes, there's a big need for that throughout California. We have a great opportunity and some really encouraging momentum right now. So I'm acknowledging one of the comments in the chat. So this is a program that launched last year, and that is when I joined the team at the Wildlife Conservation Network. And as GJ mentioned, before coming to WCN, I was with Peninsula Open Space Trust. So working in and around the Santa Cruz Mountains, where my role was really working at the landscape scale on connectivity conservation issues, really as a key strategy for biodiversity conservation. And so that involved conservation planning, land acquisition, land stewardship. And so here's an image from a few years back in the Santa Cruz Mountains, looking east towards the Diablo Range across a really crucial connective landscape called Coyote Valley, the valley floor that's just south of San Jose. And there's been amazing conservation work happening there in recent years. The work also took me to perhaps less picturesque places. So this is a lot of time on the side of the road. This is along Highway 101 in Santa Clara County. We're investigating a drainage structure. So this culvert was built to convey water under the highway. And we know that wildlife sometimes will find and use these as sort of de facto crossing structures. So we're looking for evidence of wildlife use and assessing whether this is an opportunity to enhance this site for safe passage. And so we'll definitely get more into this topic towards the end of the presentation. But this is some background about myself to say that, working in different aspects of conservation, really landscape scale connectivity conservation, exposed me to many of the challenges that we're dealing with fragmentation and how to address it in what is very much a human-dominated landscape. So thinking about habitat quality and the scale and the configuration and the various types of interventions for us to really keep this landscape stitched together so that this amazing diversity of life that we share the state with can persist and live their lives. So this focus on connectivity is really the central approach or North Star value of WCN's California Wildlife Program. We're working to conserve connectivity throughout California. We know that it's a fundamental principle that's essential for healthy and resilient ecosystems and therefore intertwined with the health and quality of life in our human communities. So really honing in on the importance of connectivity. We see this at all different levels. It affects individual animals. We think about those that need to access different types of habitat patches to meet their daily needs or find resources for reproduction. We think about it as relates to migration. So we do have some migratory deer in certain parts of California, and they need to be able to travel between seasonal ranges. And that will involve encountering all kinds of challenges along the way if we don't address those properly. We think about connectivity from a climate change and climate adaptation lens. We think about it as it relates to plants or less mobile organisms and communities that we can expect to need to shift gradually over many generations as conditions on the ground continue to change. And we also think about how important diverse and connected habitats are in order to have the best odds to provide climate refugia. And so places that have suitable habitat conditions and niches for the diversity of life that we have here. So really important at the systems level there. And here's an animal that's really on the top of our minds a lot, as Gigi alluded to in the introduction. This is the Puma or mountain lion. And there's some really dire situations that we're working to intervene before it's too late. And this is mainly because this is an animal that is just far-ranging day to day. And we've learned from research throughout the state that there are a number of populations that are actually genetically isolated from one another. So this is a top predator, especially in coastal and Southern California. And if these populations aren't connected genetically, meaning able to interbreed with one another and enrich that genetic diversity, we start to see negative health impacts that threaten the species, threaten the population. And what we can't afford to see happen is lose these apex predators because of what we would then expect to see cascading through the system. So we have focused energy within this program to restoring genetic connectivity for these at-risk populations. So when it comes to pressures on connectivity, we're really thinking of it as two main themes. The first perhaps is not much of a surprise, and that is linear infrastructure. Linear infrastructure, primarily highways, but other roads and to some extent rails, including planned rail systems in California. And the main point here is that there is a lot of work, a tremendous amount of work to be done to maintain the existing connectivity across these features, with the first step being figure out what's going on and then maintain that, but also, and probably to a larger degree, is restoring connectivity or permeability across these so that wildlife are able to find safe passage. The other main theme is, a broader challenge around land use, especially, looking at this diagram here from the center to the left, the types of urban, suburban, and rural sprawl that we see throughout a lot of California, and tremendous challenges that we have against much of the status quo, which is promoting this kind of development, which in turn is into high habitat and often high wildfire risk zones. And so we need the wildlife crossings at the highways, but we also need to be really thinking about across the landscape in California at the state level, how do we achieve this interconnected network of habitats that includes the core areas that can function as strongholds for wildlife, and really limit or prohibit the kind of sprawl that we see that undermines and degrades habitat quality at scale throughout the state. And so the key way that we're able to approach this through the California Wildlife Program is by working with our collaborators, harnessing resources, working with our community, and funding a diverse portfolio of projects and efforts of different types at different scales. And so that's really key to the approach here, is complementary efforts that are working together to push the needle on these issues. So the first project that I'll highlight is a grant to the Wildlands Network, so one of our NGO partners, and they're looking at a statewide inventory of wildlife crossing projects. This is really foundational work that there are bits and pieces in different places of what the picture looks like if someone were to ask, okay, we know we need wildlife crossings in California. Where are all the ones that are in progress? Where are ones that we know there are locations, but maybe haven't made it past the initial studies that need to be done? But that information hasn't been compiled. And so Wildlands Network is developing an inventory of all wildlife crossing projects throughout California, including their status. And what that'll help is several key pieces that we need in these early days of the California Wildlife Program. It'll help us work to focus our efforts to advance priority projects. It'll help us work with other funders to prioritize and coordinate efficiently to help these forward. Wildlands Network is doing a ton of great work on state policy to promote wildlife crossings and educate public officials and the general public about the importance of these. So this is a tool that will have multiple purposes and really foundational to what we're trying to help make happen. Wildlife crossings, just for reference, we're talking about structures like this one in Wyoming that goes over the highway, this one in Oregon that goes under. We'll get back to this later, but different types of structures, whether it's over or under, can be completely successful for promoting safe passage for wildlife, depending on certain site and other considerations. Another effort at the state level, which is really working on those broader sprawl land use issues, is a coalition called the Alliance for Housing and Climate Solutions. And so the premise for this group is really a dedicated think tank to identify, develop new policies, otherwise engage in conversations around policy and land use that really have a balanced core goal of incentivizing infill. Basically, we need to produce housing where, close to, in existing communities, close to jobs, close to transportation, simultaneously with advancing policy to prevent or prohibit sprawl. So this is a group that has been in the first year or so really productive in developing capacity by bringing together housing policy experts and environmental policy experts, finding areas of agreement in the middle, and working as a think tank to come up with new ideas to really push that paired vision forward, and seeing the housing crisis as a climate crisis interconnected. Another project we're supporting is really drilling deeper into the issues going on with the threatened puma populations and the Central Coast and Southern California, which are candidates for listing under the California Endangered Species Act, largely because of this genetic fragmentation issue. And so this is work that UC Santa Cruz is doing to sequence the puma genome, provide a better picture of the genetic health of these different populations, and also look at the temporal changes in the landscape as in comparing that to what they're seeing in the genome. So this is information that'll be really useful to practitioners working particularly in the Central Coast and Southern California to help figure out what kinds of interventions we need on the ground to restore that connectivity. Here's an image from the National Park Service, the researchers down there, Southern California, of the infamous Kinked Tale. So this, I first learned of this in the case of the Florida panther, which is also a mountain lion. And this is one of those telltale signs that inbreeding is occurring. And there's some other effects that scary negative effects towards reproductive success, but that Kinked Tale seems to be a trademark thing. And just learned that researchers up in the Santa Cruz Mountains got a cat with a Kinked Tale on camera. So the situation is dire, and there's also evidence through the latest research that it's not too late, and that by some of these targeted interventions, wildlife crossings, and then the like, we can do a lot to increase the health of these populations fairly rapidly if they're able to access each other. Another project we're really excited about is work that the UC Davis Wildlife Health Center is getting together in the Tehachapi Mountains. And this is a really important landscape and existing data gap. So we're thrilled to be able to support this work. What the folks there are going to be doing over the next few years is a multifaceted study to better understand wildlife connectivity in that landscape. They'll be tracking pumas with GPS collars. They'll be using cameras at existing drainage features under the highways to understand how pumas and other wildlife are interacting with those features. And this is the kind of study that we have seen be so tremendously leveraged in other locations once this kind of information is available. So whether it's changes to highway infrastructure that might be appropriate, whether it's changes to local land use, land acquisition, for example, by conservation groups. So this is the kind of foundational information that we're really glad to be working with them. So when I mention this being an important landscape, it is particularly so for those threatened puma populations. So we've got the spot identified just above the label for the transverse ranges. And it's essentially a linchpin, or can be characterized as a linchpin between those Southern Coast ranges and the Southern California ranges and the Sierra Nevada. And so ultimately we need to have those landscapes sufficiently linked with one another and into the Sierra so that these far-ranging animals can interbreed. So moving up to the Central Coast, which is a priority focus area that we've been investing in a lot thus far, is work in Santa Clara County by the Santa Clara Valley Habitat Agency. And so this is a grant that we contributed toward a multi-million-dollar portfolio of projects that they have been developing in Pacheco Pass, focused on Highway 152. And that involves land protection, installation of fencing to keep animals off the highway and guide them to existing underpass features, and then also develop the plans all the way to what we call shovel-ready designs for a wildlife crossing, a wildlife overcrossing structure. So a new dedicated design specifically for wildlife in that landscape. And so they've been demonstrating tremendous leadership in this region. So we've got it highlighted right there in the yellow-orange color, Santa Clara County, Pacheco Pass, focused on Highway 152. This is a fairly intact landscape, a lot of great habitat, wildlife activity, all the usual wildlife that you'd expect to see, plus Thule elk, if you weren't expecting those. And so there's a lot going on out there, and the highway really is the main issue at this point that the Habitat Agency and other collaborators are working on addressing. Staying in the Central Coast, another project that we were able to support was the acquisition or the permanent protection of just under 541 acres in San Benito County. And so this was accomplished via a grant to the Trust for Public Land, who acquired this property for permanent conservation protection. It's in a really key constrained choke point type location between the Santa Cruz Mountains and the Gavilan Range. One of the exciting layers about the project is that it includes permanent rights to the Amamutsan tribal band and co-management for the stewardship of that property. So when I use the term choke point, hoping to illustrate that a bit here. So the property is under that circle near the center of the screen. And this is superimposed over some landscape modeling that the Nature Conservancy developed. And so this is really looking at the landscape connectivity and classifying it through some different types. The gray and beige colors represent areas that have been more or less converted to other uses with relatively low habitat value. So these are the urban settings, more intensive agriculture, whereas the red, the green, the blue are where there is relatively more of an intact habitat and connectivity potential. And so this property is really an important kind of a capstone, if you will, on the northern part of the Gavilan Range and part of a multi-phase, multi-project approach, as is often the case, often if not always the case, that's needed to secure connectivity. Additional property needing to be protected in this area, given the pace and scale of development, and there's work to be done on wildlife crossing infrastructure as well. Here's a closer look at the property outlined in orange, also noting the access. It in a way really holds the line. That's the town of San Juan Bautista that you see towards the bottom of the screen. You also see some of the lower density rural residential development. And this is the type of landscape where the type of rural ranchette subdivision is really a use that we could easily see increasing throughout this landscape. And we know that would present many issues for wildlife. And so protecting a property like this really helps hold that line as that capstone in the northern part of the Gavilan Range. A lot of great habitat on the property, oak woodlands, grasslands, wetlands, other water resources. So really capturing or providing the diversity and habitat resources that we tend to look for as a priority in this type of a project. Here's an image of a female puma with her cub that was taken just off the property. And we're thinking about future actions to protect additional land and also construct wildlife crossing infrastructure. So that brings us into the last part of the presentation here, which is about wildlife crossings and how they're designed. And I wanted to start here with an image of one of the crossings in Banff, because this is a question that I have received a lot of times over the years, which is, boy, those are fantastic projects. Why don't we have projects like that throughout California? And what I will say is it's a long time coming, and there's a lot of momentum for this type of work right now. I'm tempted to say that we're at a tipping point, but I really feel that we're just over this tipping point with the implementation of multiple projects, one in the Bay Area on Highway 17, which is being constructed right now, a project in Southern California. And then, I think that those have really done a lot, and other similar work on connectivity to elevate the profile of this. And so I think we're headed into a new era over the next 10 plus years, and the California Wildlife Program is coming online right at a time where we can do a lot to help get new projects positioned on the map and advance them towards implementation. And that's the collective we, and that's what we're trying to do through this program and how we approach it. So how it starts is really with the on-the-ground studies, to figure out what and where is needed. So here is a video from a project I was involved in a few years back with Peninsula Open Space Trust and Pathways for Wildlife. Hopefully some of you have seen this. It definitely generated a viral moment throughout the internet. And I think we can attribute that virality to this interaction here between this coyote and this badger that had found this existing drainage structure under the highway. And not only are they using it to get passage, but they're traveling together. And so the first step is really is often to look at what's going on. If and how are wildlife using existing structures? What species to what degree? We also layer in roadkill information. I'm not going to show any images, but we can picture what we're talking about there. And the key element here is overlaying complementary data sources. So a lot of times it's these type of camera studies looking at existing structures, overlaying roadkill to see how it's distributed and what the composition of that roadkill is. Are we seeing a lot of roadkill near an existing drainage structure? Are we seeing it where there don't appear to be anything available? There's, of course, the human safety element that becomes involved, motorist safety, when dealing with wildlife vehicle collisions. So that's something that comes into play with depending on the characteristics of that. The larger animals tend to be prioritized through that lens because of the implications for driver safety. Telemetry data, so GPS collar data, is always useful when that's available. And so here's data from a Puma that was being tracked by the Santa Cruz Puma project out of UC Santa Cruz. And this is right by the Nyland property acquisition, so that property is just over here. You can see my cursor. So this is an animal that came down from the Santa Cruz Mountains, south from the Santa Cruz Mountains, presumably would have accessed the Gavilan Range, but the sense is that got hit and killed on Highway 101, just above that label for the Gavilan Range. And we know that other pumas have been killed there and other species as well. And so we've been in conversations with a group of organizations and agencies who are really keyed in on this area. And the next steps are to explore alternatives for one or more new crossing structures. And so that's work that we'll stay engaged in the years to come. It's also useful to layer in habitat suitability. So whereas the cameras and the roadkill can tell us what's happening right at the road itself, the telemetry data and habitat suitability modeling help us look across the landscape and put things in a broader perspective. And so this is modeling on Puma habitat suitability that Justin Dellinger and co produced. And so we're always looking to layer this in when possible. So complementary data sets, they have their different strengths and different limitations, but when we can look at them together, we can start to more or less pinpoint the locations for where structures may be needed. And then once we get into the site selection, that's refined through the rigorous engineering, because this is hard infrastructure. And so that continues into the design development. I really wanted to highlight and celebrate this project, Liberty Canyon, Southern California. Hopefully folks have been reading about that in the news. We were not involved in that project. So huge shout out to National Wildlife Federation, the National Park Service, Caltrans, the Resource Conservation District. These projects always take a lot of groups to come together. It's a fantastic project and has done so much to raise the profile of this issue in California. And so I give a lot of due credit to that for contributing to the momentum that we're seeing now. Another reason that I am bringing this slide up is because of the design elements. So got the location, where the crossing needs to go, and I think they've done some really ingenious details here. The habitat features really are designed to be as seamless a condition, and thinking about the diverse community of wildlife that are in that area, that the goal is to have them use this as a seamless connection across the highway. And so that's something that we see across projects, is really being informed by the local conditions and the focal species or target users. The other piece that I think is really progressive about this are the berms that were developed, these embankments along the highway. And so there's been some great research out of UC Davis and UCLA that's looking at impacts of light and noise, especially around linear infrastructure. And I think this is something that we need to continue to take ever seriously and incorporate these kind of designs into effective crossing structures, because roads are bright and loud, and we want to do everything we can so that we can attract animals to use them and try to make this as, repair as seamless a connection as possible. And on the upside, we have found that, through the implementation of enough of these projects, is that they're tremendously successful when they're built with the right habitat features, and when they're large enough, and when they have fencing associated to keep animals off the road. They really do work. So for a bit of contrast, here's a great project in Utah. So really different conditions here. One of the things that I really appreciate about this is the smaller habitat features. So we've got the boulders, we've got some wood around there. And what we see is that, again, with an eye towards a seamless connection, some animals that are using this, they could cross multiple times a day or a night, but other animals will actually take up residence, especially some of the smaller mammals or reptiles, depending. And so incorporating these features really does create that habitat connection, not just for animals that would be inclined to move through, but for animals that otherwise that stretch of highway would be entirely inhospitable. And then all of a sudden, as a turn of phrase, habitat is restored there. For some additional contrast, this is up in Snoqualmie Pass in Washington, where the Washington State Department of Transportation has been a real leader in implementing these structures. So some similarities from what we've seen: it's large, it has a combination of features, and we've got this elk herd using it. And they've also been incorporating undercrossings. And so some of the successful designs that we see out there incorporate, over a stretch of highway, a combination of both overcrossing and undercrossing features. And so that can be informed by the site conditions, as well as the species that are in that area, where some seem to use both or either, and some seem to have a preference. And so the key point with these undercrossings is make them large and open. That is probably the biggest thing that we can do to have them be successful. So we have a lot of work to do with wildlife crossings. It's a long time coming. We know that getting them built in the right places in California is going to be essential to restore that health and the connectivity to Puma populations, but also more broadly to keep the landscape stitched together for resident and wider ranging wildlife. So I feel like this is a really exciting turning point for the conservation community, and it'll be a good next decade plus to implement these and other complementary projects. So we have a great opportunity here through the WCN California Wildlife Program to function as a hub or a node within this community of practitioners that are working on different aspects of connectivity conservation in California, whether it's at a statewide or a regional or a local level. And part of what I'm excited to see thus far in the program is how these projects complement each other in different ways and different scales. And I think that's a really important element of how we have worked and how we want to continue to work. Our aspiration really is to support the amazing and diverse web of life that we share this state with. And so it's an exciting time. And again, appreciate you making the time to join us today and to learn more about what we're doing.
Great. Well, thank you, Neal, for this really in-depth overview of, well, actually very broad overview, but you could go in depth on many of those projects. And I know that there's been a number of links shared on the chat for people who want to go and learn more. I'd like to pick up maybe where you just ended about this collaborative approach and how really we're trying to make sure that the whole is more than the sum of the parts. And I think that's true not just here in California, but overall. So I'll start broad, and then we'll go deep. But I know that we have some of our international colleagues. I know Claudio is watching the call, and he leads the Ethiopian wolf conservation program in Ethiopia. So thanks to Claudio for joining us. We have some people here who have worked or supported the work of Lori Marker with Cheetah Conservation Fund. How do you see some of the lessons that could be exchanged between domestic efforts here and international conservation, whether it be on connectivity or on genetics? So there are some mentions of kinked tails also being noticed in cheetah in Namibia. Where do you see are some of the opportunities for those exchanges?
Yeah, a couple that come to mind are with these engineered wildlife crossings. There's not necessarily the precedence in California, but there's been a lot of great work in different countries around the world on that. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for comparing what works just from an engineering and a design standpoint. And so I think that's an exciting thing. Where there are situations where the actual planning of the road in say a new road in the first place is a really tremendous opportunity. These are kind of surgical, almost Band-Aid type interventions, right? But avoidance is always better than mitigation if possible. So I think there's a great opportunity to exchange ideas about crossing infrastructure and the transportation ecology or linear infrastructure side of things. I think so. Something that's been really inspiring to me since joining WCN and getting exposed to the work of the different partners and folks in the WCN community is also just about and I'm going to have to go into or get to a little nuance on this, but community-based conservation and what that looks like in different contexts. And everywhere where we're working, we're in a state of 40 million people, and thinking about the different types of projects and efforts and really the partners that we're working with, it brings a lot to mind about what we are trying to do is important and how we are going about it is equally important. And so without getting too specific, I'll just acknowledge that I've appreciated the, widening my aperture in a sense, and just learning from the success stories that other people have had, really with how they connect with people where they live and help them, build leadership and investment in these efforts too.
Great, thank you, Neal. So I'm going to pick up on a few questions that have come up from the audience. I think I'll probably try to group them by themes. We'll start on some of the political and some of the funding side of things. And I think there's a question from Ronnie about whether you see any opportunities for new funding sources for safe passages that might come from parks or local cities, counties that would want to utilize these overcrossing for public space, kind of similar to what's been done in the Presidio.
Okay. So I think to start on that, it's a good question, great question. Thank you. We are in the midst of it, I'll just say, interesting time relative to public funding. the interesting piece of being, how is this going to be directed? But what is just amazing in a mind-boggling kind of way is the magnitude of what we're seeing. And so I know that there are healthy advocacy efforts working to direct or influence public funding towards the implementation of wildlife crossing infrastructure. There's the federal funding side of things, which is also, as part of the infrastructure bond. I'm hoping we collectively can bring some of that funding to California in part with the state funding. And then there's a big role for private funding as well, to bring it all together, because these are multi-million-dollar infrastructure projects, and we know we need more of them. And one of the examples I shared about the statewide inventory that Wildlands Network is developing is that's going to really do a lot to help us put in perspective exactly how much do we need to bring together for the state. And then there was another piece to the question, I think, about kind of a mixed use approach to these wildlife crossing and people crossing. Was I understanding that right, GJ?
Well, yes, I think in the context of whether some of these might be used for public space by local cities or parks in that context. So yeah, so these crossings sometimes aren't just in the middle of nowhere. Right. They can very much be in human dominated landscapes.
Yeah, very much. And I think that's a tricky one that we need to be, just eyes wide open about what we're trying to accomplish there. And so, I know of at least one example in Texas where it is in a more urban context, and there is a trail for people piece there. Another way to approach it, depending on the goals, it would be an example by the Mid-Peninsula Regional Open Space District here in the San Francisco Bay Area, where there's a location identified where we really need a wildlife crossing. We also need a regional trail crossing, and what they decided to do was develop two different structures. And I think that was a really solid move given the type of wildlife use that we were trying to promote. So in general, for these crossings to be effective, it is generally best to have separate crossings and minimize human presence there.
Great, thank you. Just want to piggyback also on some of these things. There's so many interconnections, but Meredith also mentioned, I think when in the context of talking about Kinked Tales, and you mentioned Florida Panthers, and she thought that there had been a fair amount of progress in Florida, and I want to comment that indeed she's right. I have a deep affinity to Florida because I spent a number of years there for graduate work, and I know that Florida sometimes gets a bad rap and their politics can be funky, but in fact, when it comes down to wildlife conservation and protection, they've been quite progressive. And I think they passed a Florida Wildlife Corridor Act unanimously. I can't think the last time that I've heard of politicians doing anything unanimously. I'll ask my colleague Megan to put a link to a cool article from The Guardian on that, but it's really interesting to see the kind of work that politicians can achieve. And so relating back to California, there's a question from our audience here wondering, is there any legislation that's being discussed in California Congress that people here on this call could take action on and be actively supporting or fighting if there's a negative one?
Yeah, so I'll start by noting, and by way of trivia, and I hope I'm right on this one, is that I believe the first dedicated wildlife crossing built in the US, if not North America, was in the 50s in Florida. Is an underpass. So if anybody knows that detail with certainty, then please let us know in the chat. But on that, what I would say, the big one that comes to mind is Assembly Bill 2344, which is a wildlife crossing bill that is making its way through the process right now, but letters of support, engaging your local officials. I would encourage that if that's something that you're inclined to do. So what that would do, that bill, if it makes it through, is it would require the creation of an action plan statewide. So the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and Caltrans working together, and I'm sure with the various environmental stakeholders who have information and knowledge on these issues, and develop that action plan for crossings throughout the state. And so, that's the one of two proponents for that project is the Wildlands Network. And that's another reason why we came together around this statewide inventory, is because they're a sponsor of that bill and doing great work with that. It would also involve some changes to the code such that wildlife connectivity would need to be more proactively assessed relative to the state highway system.
Great, thank you, Neal. All right, we're going to keep testing your trivia on a few questions. Keep your answers short on these, but if anybody has more questions, comments, feel free to reach out to Neal afterwards and give him a pass if he doesn't have the full answer. He doesn't have encyclopedic knowledge, but a few questions have come in about specific spots with regards to crossing and connectivity, Neal. So can you give us any comments maybe of safe crossing status or need for Highway 17 in the Santa Cruz Mountains?
Yeah, so 17. Shout out to the Land Trust of Santa Cruz County. So project currently under construction at Laurel Curve on the Santa Cruz side of the hill that the Land Trust had been working on for the last 10 years. And it's just, I was out there last month or so, and it's just amazing to see that. So just picture a nice, huge open underpass at a key location on that side of the hill, south side. And then on the north side of the hill is that project that I was referring to by Mid-Peninsula Regional Open Space District leading that effort. And that'll be by the Lexington Reservoir. So for the locals, but two projects on Highway 17, one is already under construction. The other one will be built within the next several years.
Great. Okay, we'll stay in the Bay Area for now. Do you know of any plans for crossing in Santa Clara County or Monterey Highway or on Highway 101? A couple of people have also mentioned questions about lots of fatalities on 101, different spots.
Yeah, this is the Bay Area contingent is representing. So Monterey Highway, Coyote Valley, absolutely. So, I would just, if you're not already paying attention to the work of Peninsula Open Space Trust and the Santa Clara Valley Open Space Authority, they're doing a lot of great stuff in Coyote Valley, and we've been talking with them and seeing, if and how we can help through the California program. But as far as that landscape, the answer is yes. Multiple structures are needed, and Pacheco Pass, Santa Clara County. So we're supporting the Habitat Agency's efforts out there. So that'll result in crossing infrastructure, and then we're just getting out of Santa Clara County, more into the San Benito, Monterey area with the one other site that I mentioned. But between the Santa Cruz Mountains and the Gavilan Range is really a priority for getting new structures in.
All right. We'll add one more, but broadening out a bit more. Do you know of anything happening in San Diego County or Orange County or further down south?
So San Diego County, yes. So we've been in conversations with the Nature Conservancy. They've been doing a lot of work down there on landscape scale connectivity issues. And yeah, there are a handful of projects, some of which include highway crossings, especially East County. But what I'll reflect on that is that it is an encouraging sign to me. And now that we've launched this program through WCN, one of the really rewarding things is that I feel like the lines of communication have just increased, right? So we're working with folks who can either get connected and team up on projects, or we can connect them with others. And one thing leads to another, which I think really is the way we need to be working on these issues. And so that's been exciting. So coming back to the Southern California stuff, we'll see, but nothing in the works right now.
Okay, I just saw one last one. I'll get a quick yes or no, but then I think I'll do a plug. I mean, we get a lot of people wondering about specific areas for crossing, and I think that ties straight into one of the projects that the California Wildlife Program is funding to kind of get a list of all of these so that we can be smarter about development going forward. So the quick one, thumbs up, thumbs down. Is there something going on Highway 101 along the Gaviota Coast in SB County? I don't know, not being up. So thank you, Neal, for all that. I'm very impressed by your in-depth knowledge. That's quite amazing. Let's take a slight turn now and maybe look at and some broader questions moving away from crossing connectivity. You mentioned some of the inbreeding and negative impact of inbreeding in pumas. Are you seeing any evidence of that with other species? And that question comes from our dear and esteemed colleague Claudio, who works across numerous species besides Ethiopian wolves. But have you seen this happening besides pumas?
It has been seen in other species, but I think the puma intersection for us is, really top of mind because of their ecology and how, they can be a really effective umbrella species for landscape scale connectivity conservation. One example that comes to mind with low genetic diversity would be the Channel Islands fox, which is an island gray fox population. So if I thought on it more, I maybe come up with some other ideas there, but the puma is really the top priority right now relative to that, as far as I know.
Okay. And a question regarding puma specifically, do you have a sense of the numbers of the puma population in California?
Yeah, so the best estimates that we'll see are in the several thousands, and I'm not gonna. It's fuzzy enough that I don't want to put it more fine point on that. But what I would say is that it's not so much that we have an issue with low population sizes. It's that these populations, there's a lot of great puma habitat throughout California, and it's really some of these large blocks of habitat and populations therein that cannot access their neighbors. And so it's really that that's the issue, as opposed to low numbers.
Okay. And I guess there are questions also that come from Adrian and Scott related to human wildlife conflict. Do you see puma or cougar attacks on humans increasing in the futures with either wildfires forcing them out to retreat into cities, or just the fact that cities are expanding into their into cities are expanding into puma habitat? So do you see more human wildlife conflict, and what can the California Wildlife Program do about that?
Yeah, great question. So a couple of thoughts on that. Continuing to build and having that be the main place, or even just a major way we're developing more housing in California, being in the wildland urban interface, or the urban intermix, wildland urban intermix as it's sometimes called. That doesn't bode well for the persistence of the species, but I would venture to guess that it could increase the odds of conflict if puma remain in those areas in the first place, right? And so one of the things that I think on the conflict reduction or coexistence side, that'll be a priority, other than doing everything we can to prevent that type of development in California, would be for the communities that already exist in these landscapes, especially some of the ones that are, relatively intact and have important habitat values. And it would be great to start working with groups engaged in those communities to reduce conflict and increase the habitat quality. And so that's more of something on the horizon, but not a too distant horizon, that I would love to see us supporting.
Great. I'm gonna ask you, I think, two more questions. If there are more that come through, great, I'll try to get to them. But we could all use a bit of inspiration these days. So you just piggyback on where you ended. Where do you see as the major goals for the California Wildlife Program, and the biggest areas of success that we could have in the next year, and then in the next 5 years?
So next year, within the next year, I would say really the focus would be continuing to diversify the portfolio of projects we have. And that's both the type of project and the scale, because a lot of what we need to do is some of these foundational efforts that can cross-inform one another. Developing the inventory over the next year is going to be hugely informative for what we do from there. So within that's within the first year. Within the 5, I think there's a lot of potential for meaningful, at least incremental progress to restore connectivity for some of these Puma populations. So what that starts to look like is either more crossings actually built, or the, I guess it's an and or studies, on the ground studies that are developed to the level where we know that, all right, here's a spot that we need to develop detailed designs. So that's on the linear infrastructure side. And I think within the next 5 years, we can make some meaningful incremental progress on statewide policy around sprawl and housing issues.
Great, thanks, Neal. I see one last question that came in from the audience is, it's a broad question, so I'll ask for your answer to be brief. What do you see as the impact of climate change, lack of water, and these increased wildfires that we have here in California on our wildlife?
You know, I think the first thing that comes to mind is it's all the more importance of connectivity. You know, in a wildfire event, for animals to be able to escape if they're able, but also reestablish in areas that have burned previously. It's just the increasing importance for us to think about the systems in an interconnected way, so that that these animals have the best chance that they can have to find what they need. You know, that's one of the things I love about this kind of work, is the diversity of the wildlife that we have here, and taking time to think about their different needs and how they look so different from one another. And so I think that all really plays into the importance of connectivity at the landscape scale. Otherwise, you know, a somewhat trite, but I don't mean to be flippant, perspective is that it's, you know, climate change is only going to make things more challenging. So let's do everything we can to conserve connectivity.
Great. And what I wanted to end it up on is, in all of your work, meeting all these people who do all these different kind of projects, what really gives you hope? And what inspires you? And I think that'd be a great note to end on for the weekend.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to give two responses to that. One of them is, you know, what gives me hope, because what hope means to me is that there's energy behind it, right? It's not a passive optimism. So what gives me hope is that I have a pretty bleak idea of what's going to happen if we don't continue to work as hard as we can. And that's motivating in and of itself. And the other piece to that answer, as of this spring, was the house finches that nested and raised 4 birds right outside the kitchen window here. And I got to see them fledge off. So that was beautiful.
That's a great image. And I agree with that. I think it's hearing you, seeing your passion, seeing it from all the people we support, and seeing it from all the people who support us, who joined us on this call today. That does give me hope. And it's also great just to see, fledgling birds as a reminder that all happens. If there are any more questions, feel free to send them to Megan or to Neal directly. We're happy to connect you directly with Neal. I want to thank you all for taking an hour of your time to join us, to learn more about these issues, to connect with Neal. I think it's been put in the chat already, but we have another closer look session on Friday, July 1st with the Land Recovery Fund at 12 p.m. Pacific time. The link should be in the Zoom chat to register. And again, if you have any questions, do not hesitate to reach out to us. We are here to help answer your questions and connect you to the wildlife conservation passion that you have. And have a wonderful weekend. Stay safe, everyone. And yes, keep looking at fledgling birds when you can. And remember that together we can save wildlife. Thank you so much, Neal. Thank you so much to all of you. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye.